So, yesterday marked a momentous day for Britain with the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, and world leaders and important persons have been paying their tributes. And of course, while I agree with many of these tributes, I think they miss a couple of really important points which I wanted to make in my own slightly esoteric tribute to the Queen. The first point is about embodiment. Now, very few people really knew the Queen, and yet millions of people loved her. And I think that's because she was able to embody something that was much greater than she was. This was an immortal spirit of the British nation, something that helped define, I think, our post-1945 experiences. This was a world where society changed and where the world changed, but fundamentally Britain's role in it also altered. Britain moved from being perhaps the most awesome superpower ever seen in the world that had an empire on which the sun never set, to a power of the second rank, and had to make sense of its new identity in this shifting post-war age. Now, it has always been quite hard to describe British history. There's no revolution, there's no point of origin, there's no battle, there's no key founding father figure, and yet the country has been very powerful very recently. And I think the Queen was always very useful for putting in the gap and saying, that's what British history is in the post-war period. Similarly, British values, notoriously hard to define. What are they? Respect, toleration, fair play? But we could always, I think, point at the Queen and say, Queen Elizabeth, she represents what British values are. And I think that by embodying them in the form of a person, rather than a narrative, an ideology, or a ceremony, those kind of embodied values of Britishness became more powerful rather than less because they were contained within a person. My second point is about bipartisanship. Now, we live in an age, for good or probably for ill, of partisanship, where people disagree with each other very strongly about political questions in a much more toxic way, I think, than they did before. And the Queen's ability to rise above that political catfight, to be a figure who all respect, is, I think, something really worth defending. Now, whether you are a Tory, a Liberal, or a Socialist, I think you could find something that you admired in the Queen. For Tories, perhaps most obviously, her devotion to duty, her devotion to the Church of England, her role as defender of the faith, her role as an advocate and a symbol of the United Kingdom and the Union and the established institutions. For a Liberal, I think her symbol as a promoter of freedom and liberty throughout the world, but also of toleration for religious dissent, political debate, and even things like changing dynamics of Britain in regards to its racial identity and the new society we've became things that, while Elizabeth perhaps didn't exactly act as a progressive promoter of those causes, somehow came to embody and acquiesce to in a way that I think was quite important. Now, even socialists, who of course understandably would oppose the notion of a hereditary monarchy with power passed down by blood relations, could still, I think, at least find in Elizabeth Windsor someone who was very kind, very decent, and embodied some of the best points of human spirit. But I think that what is most important in this is the fact that whether it was Brexit, whether it was culture wars, whether it was cities versus provinces, identity politics, class versus class, the Queen was a figure that rose above all these things and stood for something that everyone, or at least in large part, could agree with and identify with. Now, this simply is just not the case with prime ministers and politicians, because the Queen, unlike them, had unimpeachable motives. She was born into her role at the age of 10 when she became heir to the throne, and simply discharged those duties in large part because there was no alternative. She could never be accused of seeking power for its own sake, of being corrupt or self-interested or attempting to just accumulate lackeys or build empires to try and mould a cult of personality and all of the other things that we often accuse politicians of doing. She was able to rise above all those things, and I think is a reminder of why it can be very nice to have a non-partisan figure at the centre of the Constitution who stays there for a very long time. My third point is perhaps the most intellectual one, but I think the most important, which is that Elizabeth was not just a model monarch, but she was a model constitutional monarch in an era of declining monarchical power. Now, a constitutional monarchy is a monarchy that governs within limitations of the constitution. And in Britain's case, that means the limitations of Parliament. And those limitations, given the very modest power of the Crown today, are very considerable, but they changed over time. Now, the beginnings of this really date to Magna Carta in 1215, which placed some small operative checks and balances on the rights of the king. But they were really established with the Glorious Revolution in 1688. Now, this was when Parliament declared the throne vacant and asked William of Orange to fill it, thus establishing the principle that the monarch governed with the consent of Parliament and only with that consent. That was underscored in 1714 when George I ascended to the throne as the first of the House of Hanover, which of course Elizabeth is directly descended from. Parliament, again, because it preferred a Protestant monarch, choosing the line of succession to amend it in a way that it saw fit, thus underscoring the principle that it was increasingly where the power now lay. Now, the Crown did at some points get back a little bit of power, especially under George III, but it was managed away during the reign of Victoria from 1837 to 1901, during that age of democratisation that characterised her reign. During that time, when more people were being given the vote, elected politicians could increasingly say, "We represent the people." And that ability, the ability to resist those who claimed that they had the people's mandate, became increasingly difficult for entrenched aristocratic power. And so under Victoria's reign, the remaining power of the monarchy generally ebbed away until the 20th century, where monarchs were largely ceremonial. But I think that that constitutional role in being this crowned figurehead, of providing what Walter Bagehot described in 1867 as the dignified part of the Constitution, ceremonial though it may be, is important because those ceremonies are powerful, those symbols are powerful, they evoke magic, they evoke a feeling of loyalty that goes beyond something rational. Some of those irrational sentiments are much more powerful than rational ones. Love, national duty, things that have caused men to run into battle and die and fall head over heels in love. Those things are very powerful, and the monarchy could embody those things in ways that technocratic businessmen, a commercial group of individuals increasingly running the country simply weren't able to do. And Elizabeth, because she really didn't put a foot wrong as monarch, and was so fantastic at wielding that kind of soft power, even through innovations like opening a Buckingham Palace to the population, being so amenable to all sorts of public engagements, enabled Britain to project that soft power, that kind of magic of the old constitution across the world, and thus put a little bit of magic into the wand of the technocratic parliamentary class who were really running Britain. And really from that, I think, is the idea that actually, while the monarchy seems a Tory institution, it's really a Whig one in its constitutional form. Now, the Whigs, of course, an old political party, but statesmen who had an arc of progress in mind, an idea that they would trim the constitution to prevent revolution and tyranny, whether it was Magna Carta, Petition of Right, the Glorious Revolution, or the Great Reform Act. All of those were concessions that allowed that progressive aristocracy who were not enthralled to history, but actively used it for their own ends, to remain in the seat of power. And thus, legitimate political power continued to reside in that small L liberal commercial class, who were socially progressive and economically capitalist. And that system did not fall to tyranny in the 19th and 20th centuries, and there were no revolutions, where there were those practically everywhere else. And those Whig values were projected domestically and across the world, with values perhaps that we can debate another time. But I think that the Queen, in inspiring the respective generations and all over the world, helped provide some of that animating magic that enabled that Whig political system, that Whig order, to govern without really any serious challenge for the 70 years of her reign. And in that respect, she was probably as powerful a figure as Queen Victoria, in enabling that constitutional monarchy with all of the values that it came to represent, those Whig values, to remain dominant in Britain. Thank you for listening to my esoteric thoughts. God save the Queen, and long live the King.